The file was officially sealed in 1978, buried deep within the state archives under a classification usually reserved for matters of national security. It was not a matter of treason or espionage. It was the story of a family, a single bloodline that had, through a century of self-imposed exile, twisted the very laws of nature and human decency into a grotesque new form. The case file for the Blackwood family of Sorrow's End Hollow began not with a crime, but with a medical anomaly so profound it defied initial belief. It began with a man named Thomas Blackwood who was brought to a rural clinic suffering from a severe infection, and whose medical records, when finally pieced together, showed that the woman who had signed his intake forms as his wife was also, irrefutably, his biological mother. The central mystery was not merely the incest, which, while abhorrent, was tragically not unheard of in the most isolated pockets of Appalachia. The true horror lay in the timeline. This was not a singular, desperate act. It was the endpoint of a deliberate, multi-generational experiment in human isolation, a legacy of consanguinity so extreme that the family tree had ceased to be a branching structure and had collapsed into a single, repeating, nightmarish loop. The investigation that followed would unearth a history hidden for over 100 years, a story of a patriarch's fanatical doctrine, a community's willful ignorance, and the devastating genetic price paid by generations born into a world that was only a few miles wide but a universe away from our own. What authorities would uncover in that shadowed hollow would force them to question the very definition of family, culpability, and the dark secrets the American landscape is capable of concealing. To understand the existence of Thomas Blackwood, one had to travel back to the aftermath of the Civil War. In 1868, a man named Jedediah Blackwood, a former Confederate soldier embittered by defeat and disillusioned with the changing world, purchased a vast, unforgiving tract of land deep in the West Virginia mountains. He named it Sorrow's End, for he intended it to be the last place his family would ever need. He brought with him his wife, his 3 sons, and 2 daughters, along with a rigid, self-penned theology that blended fire and brimstone scripture with a paranoid distrust of all outsiders. The world, in Jedediah's eyes, was a cesspool of corruption, sin, and genetic impurity. His family, the Blackwoods, would be an ark, a pure-blooded sanctuary against the coming flood of moral and racial decay. The land itself was a fortress. Sorrow's End Hollow was accessible by a single treacherous path that was often washed out by rain or blocked by snow. The steep, tree-choked ridges created a natural barrier, both physical and psychological. The Blackwoods were subsistence farmers, hunters, and trappers, their needs met by the unforgiving land they had claimed. Jedediah ruled with an iron fist and a worn leather Bible, which he frequently reinterpreted to suit his own doctrine. His most fundamental and terrifying decree was a complete prohibition on contact with the outside world. No one was to leave the hollow, and no one was to enter. This created an immediate and obvious problem for the continuation of his bloodline. Jedediah's solution was as pragmatic as it was monstrous. He declared that the blood of the Blackwoods was sacred and chosen. To mix it with the tainted blood of outsiders would be the ultimate blasphemy. In his twisted exegesis, the biblical prohibitions against incest were meant for the common man, not for a chosen people tasked with preserving a sacred lineage. Therefore, marriage was to be an internal affair. Cousins were to marry cousins. As the first generation came of age, he arranged the unions himself, officiating over ceremonies that bound his own grandchildren to one another. He recorded these unions in the front pages of his great Bible, not as a family tree, but as a testament to his divine mandate. The first generation of cousin marriages produced children who were mostly healthy, reinforcing Jedediah's belief in his own righteousness. The isolation was now absolute, cemented by a shared secret and a shared sin. Over the next few decades, the Blackwood clan grew, but their world remained static. The doctrine of isolation was passed from patriarch to patriarch, becoming an unquestionable truth. They developed their own dialect, a strange amalgam of 19th-century Appalachian English and words of their own invention, further alienating them from the rare hunter or government surveyor who might stumble upon their land. Outsiders were called the tainted, and stories were told to the children of sickness and demons that lurked beyond the ridges of Sorrow's End. By the 1920s, the first disturbing signs of extreme consanguinity began to manifest. Children were born with cleft palates, fused fingers and toes, and facial asymmetries that became known within the family simply as the Blackwood look. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, but these deaths were seen as God's will, a tragic but necessary weeding out of the weak. The small, unmarked graveyard behind the main cabin grew with each passing year, a silent testament to the genetic cul-de-sac they had built for themselves. The first crack in this sealed world appeared on a cold November morning in 1976. A deer hunter, lost and suffering from a badly broken leg, stumbled into the main clearing of the Blackwood settlement. He was met with a scene he would later describe as something from another century. Log cabins with smoke curling from stone chimneys, people dressed in homespun clothes, and faces that all bore a disturbing, uncanny resemblance to one another. He was met with suspicion and fear, but one of the women, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, took pity on him. She and her eldest son, Thomas, fashioned a crude splint for his leg and, under the cover of darkness, helped him down the treacherous path to a point where he could see the lights of a distant town. The hunter, grateful but deeply unsettled by what he had seen, made an anonymous call to the county's social services department a week later. He spoke of a family of hill folk living in squalor, of children with old faces and vacant eyes. The report was filed and, like many such calls from the remote parts of the county, largely ignored. 2 years later, the outside world would be forced to pay attention. Thomas Blackwood, the same man who had helped the hunter, gashed his arm deeply with a rusty axe while chopping wood. Within days, the wound festered, and a raging infection set in. He grew delirious with fever, and his mother, Sarah, knew that the herbal remedies passed down through generations would not save him. In a desperate act that violated a century of Blackwood law, she and 2 of her other sons carried Thomas in a makeshift litter down the mountain. They reached the paved road and flagged down a passing truck, which took them to the small county clinic. It was here that they encountered Dr. Evelyn Reed. Dr. Reed was a young, idealistic physician who had moved to rural West Virginia to serve underserved communities. She was immediately struck by the appearance of the trio who carried the near-unconscious man into her clinic. They were gaunt and pale, their clothes were worn and patched, but it was their physical features that set off alarm bells. All 3 had the same unusually wide-set eyes, the same low-set ears, and a distinct flattening of the midface. Thomas's hands, as she examined him, had partial fusion of his second and third fingers. These were all classic markers, subtle but unmistakable signs of severe, long-term genetic degradation. Her suspicions were amplified by their behavior. They were terrified, communicating with each other in a series of guttural whispers and grunts that she could barely decipher. Sarah, the matriarch, did all the talking, her English heavily accented and archaic. When Dr. Reed's nurse asked Sarah to fill out the intake forms, the woman stared at the paper with a blank expression. She could not read or write. The nurse filled it out for her, gathering the basic information. The patient's name was Thomas Blackwood. His age was approximately 30. When the nurse came to the line for spouse, Sarah hesitated for a long moment, then pointed to herself. The nurse, assuming a misunderstanding due to the woman's obvious distress and lack of education, wrote down Sarah Blackwood as the emergency contact. But later, when Dr. Reed was pressing for a more detailed medical history, she asked Sarah directly about Thomas's wife, hoping to learn about any children or inherited conditions. Sarah's response was chilling in its simplicity. "I'm his woman," she said, her eyes defiant. "He has no other." Dr. Reed tried to clarify, asking if she meant she was his mother. "I'm his mother," Sarah confirmed, without a flicker of shame or recognition that she had just stated a profound contradiction. For her, there was no contradiction. The 2 statements were one and the same. Dr. Reed stabilized Thomas with powerful antibiotics, but she could not shake the disturbing encounter. The physical anomalies, the strange dialect, the woman's calm declaration of an impossible relationship. It all pointed to something deeply wrong. After Thomas was discharged, she did something she had never done before. She contacted the county sheriff, Frank Brody. Brody was a veteran lawman, a man who had seen his share of Appalachian poverty and its associated dysfunctions. He had heard the old stories, the local folklore about the hollow folk of Sorrow's End, a clan of inbred recluses who kept to themselves. Most people dismissed them as ghost stories, a local legend to scare children. But the hunter's anonymous tip from 2 years prior, combined with the credible testimony of a medical doctor, was enough to warrant a formal inquiry. Sheriff Brody began by pulling county records. The Blackwood name appeared on a land deed from 1868, but after that, the paper trail went cold. There were no birth certificates, no death certificates, no marriage licenses, no tax records. For over 100 years, the Blackwood family had existed as ghosts on the official record. They were born, they lived, and they died on their mountain, completely invisible to the state. Brody's next step was to drive out toward Sorrow's End. He found the path the hunter had described, a barely there track that was more of a stream bed than a road. He didn't attempt to enter. He knew that a direct, unannounced approach would be met with hostility and would only drive them deeper into hiding. Instead, he started canvassing the few scattered homes and farms in the foothills, asking questions. Most residents knew nothing, offering only vague rumors. But then he found Martha Higgins, an elderly woman in her late 80s, whose family had lived in the area for generations. She remembered her grandmother speaking of the Blackwoods. They were the God-fearing folk who went up the mountain to keep their blood clean, she recalled, her voice thin and reedy. My grandmother said they made a pact with the Lord to stay apart from the world. She said the devil would claim any of them who came down. Martha also provided a crucial piece of corroborating evidence. She remembered, as a young girl in the 1930s, seeing a group of Blackwood men come down to the nearest general store, a rare occurrence prompted by a harsh winter. She described their appearance in detail, noting the family face that all of them shared, the wide eyes, the flat features. Her account confirmed that the genetic markers Dr. Reed had observed were not a recent development, but a generational trait. The investigation was now a multi-agency effort. Dr. Reed provided her medical observations, Sheriff Brody provided the historical context and lack of official records, and social services began to build a case for neglect and endangerment. They needed more than anecdotal evidence and a single unsettling clinic visit. They needed to know the full scope of what was happening in Sorrow's End Hollow. The break came from an unexpected source. A few weeks after Thomas's release from the clinic, a young woman, barely 16 years old, appeared at the sheriff's office. She was terrified and emaciated. She introduced herself as Mary, the younger sister of Thomas Blackwood. The trip to the clinic, the brief exposure to the outside world, had planted a seed of curiosity and defiance in her. She had run away, a capital crime in her family's world. Through a series of painstaking interviews, conducted with the help of a linguist to decipher her dialect, Mary painted a horrifyingly detailed picture of life in the hollow. She confirmed the history passed down from Jedediah. She explained the rules of marriage. First cousins were ideal, but as the gene pool shrank, uncle-niece and aunt-nephew pairings had become common. She described children born with severe deformities, many of whom did not live past their first year. These infants were called God's special angels, and were buried in the unmarked graveyard with little ceremony. Her testimony confirmed the investigators' worst fears, but the horror was about to escalate. When asked about her brother Thomas and their mother Sarah, Mary explained it with a chilling matter-of-factness. The family patriarch, her father and Thomas's father, had died several years ago. With a shortage of available partners of the appropriate age, it had been decided by the family's remaining elders that Sarah, still able to bear children, should be joined with her strongest son, Thomas, to ensure the continuation of the Blackwood line. It was not seen as a sin, but as a duty. The scope of the horror was now clear. This was not just a case of neglect or isolated abuse. It was a closed, self-perpetuating system of ritualized incest that had been operating for over a century. Armed with Mary's testimony, the state had enough to obtain a court order. The official intervention was planned with the delicacy of a hostage negotiation. A team of social workers, medical professionals, and sheriff's deputies, led by Brody and Reed, made their way up the mountain path at dawn. They found the settlement just as the hunter had described it. About 24 individuals were living in the cluster of dilapidated cabins. The initial reaction was one of fear and confusion. The patriarch, an elderly man named Ezekiel, Thomas's uncle, met them with a shotgun and a Bible, quoting scripture about the evils of the tainted. Sheriff Brody, speaking calmly and slowly, was able to de-escalate the situation. The Blackwoods, for all their isolation, were malnourished and lacked the resources for a real fight. They were a people physically and mentally broken by generations of inbreeding. The team moved in, and the true extent of the damage became devastatingly apparent. Of the 27 people found in the hollow, almost all exhibited some form of congenital abnormality. Conditions ranged from syndactyly and polydactyly, fused and extra digits, to severe craniofacial deformities consistent with Apert syndrome. Many had significant cognitive impairments, with IQs that placed them in the severely disabled range. They were suffering from a host of medical problems related to poor nutrition and a complete lack of modern healthcare. The children were the most tragic victims. Several were nonverbal, and none had received any form of education. The Blackwoods were carefully removed from the hollow and transported to a regional medical center for a full evaluation. It was a scene of profound culture shock. They had never seen electric lights, flushing toilets, or televisions. The experience was terrifying for them, and the medical and psychological evaluations that followed cataloged a legacy of suffering. Genetic testing was ordered for every member of the family to map their lineage and confirm the relationships Mary had described. Dr. Reed enlisted the help of Dr. Alistair Finch, a leading geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, who was fascinated and horrified by the case. He saw it as a unique, if monstrous, opportunity to study the effects of extreme, long-term human inbreeding. The lab work took several weeks, but the results provided the irrefutable scientific confirmation of the horror. Dr. Finch's report was a stark, clinical document that read like a dystopian novel. The genetic diversity of the Blackwood family was almost non-existent. Their coefficient of inbreeding was the highest ever recorded in a human population, comparable to that of sibling-to-sibling offspring in a laboratory setting. The DNA confirmed that every member of the clan was descended from the original patriarch, Jedediah Blackwood. The analysis of Thomas and Sarah's DNA was the final, grim punctuation. The probability of Sarah being Thomas's mother was 99,999%. The probability of Thomas being the father of Sarah's youngest child, a 2-year-old girl with severe developmental issues, was also 99,999%. The family tree was not a tree at all. It was a tangled, thorny wreath. While the geneticists worked, investigators on-site at Sorrow's End made another discovery. Tucked away in a loose stone in the hearth of the main cabin, wrapped in oilcloth, was Jedediah Blackwood's original Bible. The front pages contained his handwritten manifesto, the doctrine of purity and isolation. But it was the pages that followed that served as the family's chronicle. For over 100 years, the patriarch of each generation had recorded the births, deaths, and, most importantly, the marriages. The spidery script, changing in style with each generation, laid out the family's path into genetic collapse. It recorded the unions of first cousins, then uncles and nieces. The final entry, dated 5 years prior and written in a barely legible scrawl by the patriarch Ezekiel, read, "Sarah, widow of my brother Jacob, is joined to her son Thomas, that the line of Jedediah shall not perish from this earth. God's will be done." It was the full confession, the human element that gave voice to the cold, hard data of the DNA tests. There, in faded ink, was the twisted logic that had governed their lives and sealed their fate. The worst discovery was yet to come. Behind the cabins, in the area Mary had described as the place for God's special angels, forensic anthropologists began a careful excavation. They unearthed the remains of over 40 infants and young children. Pathological analysis revealed that the tiny skeletons were riddled with the catastrophic evidence of their lineage. They found skulls grotesquely misshapen by craniosynostosis, spinal columns twisted by scoliosis, and bones so brittle they had likely fractured multiple times in the children's short, painful lives. This was not a graveyard of tragic accidents. It was a testament to a predictable and inevitable genetic apocalypse. Jedediah's quest for purity had created the ultimate impurity, a bloodline that was systematically destroying itself from within. The legal ramifications were a nightmare. How do you prosecute people who were both perpetrators and victims? Thomas and Sarah had produced a child, a clear case of statutory incest. But both were victims of a system they were born into, with severe cognitive impairments that brought their mental culpability into question. The patriarch, Ezekiel, who had sanctioned the union, was also a product of the same system. The state's attorney ultimately made a controversial decision. No criminal charges were filed. The Blackwoods were declared wards of the state, a decision that acknowledged their inability to function in modern society and the state's own failure to notice their existence for a century. The focus shifted from punishment to rehabilitation. The process of integration was fraught with difficulty. The younger children, like Mary, showed the most promise. They were placed in specialized foster care, received intensive educational and medical support, and slowly began to adapt. Mary eventually learned to read and write and became a powerful, albeit reluctant, advocate for children in isolated communities. For the older members, the transition was nearly impossible. The modern world was a terrifying, overstimulating cacophony. Many, including Sarah and Ezekiel, were institutionalized in long-term care facilities, where they lived out their days in a state of perpetual confusion and longing for the quiet, familiar misery of the hollow. Thomas, physically and mentally broken, died of pneumonia just 3 years after being removed from Sorrow's End. He never fully comprehended the world he had been brought into, nor the one he had left behind. 20 years later, the Blackwood case remains a haunting footnote in the annals of American social work and genetics. The land at Sorrow's End was declared unfit for habitation and is now part of a state wilderness preserve, the cabins slowly being reclaimed by the forest, erasing the physical evidence of the century of suffering that occurred there. The case led to significant policy changes in West Virginia and other Appalachian states, resulting in the creation of reach-out programs designed to identify and offer services to isolated families, ensuring that no community could ever become as invisible as the Blackwoods had been. Scientifically, the genetic data collected from the family was invaluable. It provided unprecedented insight into the expression of recessive genes and the devastating speed of genetic deterioration in a closed human population. Dr. Finch published several influential papers on the Blackwood genome, which became required reading in university genetics programs. The family's tragedy, in a grim irony, advanced human knowledge in ways that would help prevent similar situations in the future. The survivors' paths diverged. Some, like Mary, broke the cycle, married outsiders, and had healthy children, deliberately severing all ties to their past. Others remained in state care for the rest of their lives, ghosts of a forgotten world, forever trapped between the mountain they knew and the society they could never understand. The story of the Blackwood family is a chilling parable about the darkness that can flourish in the shadows of neglect. It is a testament to the fact that isolation, whether imposed by geography, ideology, or fear, can become a prison where the most fundamental laws of nature are broken. The legacy of Jedediah Blackwood was not one of purity, but of pain. His hollow, meant to be a sanctuary, became a laboratory of human misery. The final, somber lesson of Sorrow's End is a reflection on collective responsibility, a reminder that a society is ultimately judged by how it treats its most invisible citizens, and that the secrets buried in the lonely places of the world will, eventually and tragically, find their way into the light. Truth, however painful, is the only thing that can truly set the captives free.